Welcome to this webinar. Today, this is part of the Executive Master Management of Research Infrastructure Financial Management module. Today, we speak about the service costing model and pricing of services in a marine research stations. And we'll be happy to have a special guest, like case from Antonio Villanueva of the Toralla Marine Science Station of the University of Vigo. Please, Antonio, we have a presentation from Antonio, and then this will be followed by a Q&A session. Antonio, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thanks, Enrico. Hello, everyone. I want to thank all the MA staff and Enrico especially for giving me the opportunity to present and discuss with you all about how to better operate our research infrastructure. And what I'm going to talk about today with you is about how do costing and pricing the services. In my case, in a marine research infrastructure, taking the example of the Toralla Marine Station where I work. So a little bit about myself. You all know me, but I will give you a short presentation. I am the Marine Research Infrastructure Manager at the University of Vigo. I am a marine biologist, and most of my professional career has been on aquaculture management. So I'm a fish farmer. And since 2010, I am involved in research infrastructures on marine stations. And I have an interest, especially on strategic planning, business modeling, operational management, especially on service development and on quality management. So a bit about our research station. Toralla Marine Science Station is located in northwestern Spain, right over Portugal, right there where you see the red dot. It's a facility that belongs to the University of Vigo, and it was initially thought to provide services to the university researchers, but it very soon became open to any researcher with an interest in marine research from any institution, either public or private. So the idea behind the station is it's a 100% service station. Even the internal people from the University of Vigo are users of the station. And the idea is to do all the technical and administrative support to research, so the researchers can take care only of their research. So this is the idea. The scientists do the science, and these guys, the ECIMAT staff, take care of the rest. In order to do that, we have 28 technical people working at the station. We provide services to close to 300 users per year, and up to 5,000 requests of service per year. The services we provide go from accessing marine ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, the use of laboratories, technology platforms, aquaria, scientific equipment, and we also provide biological resources for research. So that can be biological resources we keep in collection in the station, or it can be biological resources collected from the sea by our technical people and made available to any researcher wanting to use it. ECIMAT, our facility, is one of the 24 stations that are part of the ENDRC. You can see in this map, the ENDRC has 9 member countries and 24 institutions providing facilities for this distributed research infrastructure. The ENDRC vision is to become a global reference research infrastructure for marine biology and ecology, and trying to support scientists in order to respond to global challenges from the perspective of marine biology and ecology. The EMDRC was integrated into the ESG roadmap in 2008. As I said before, 9 countries are members of the EMDRC. We submitted our final ERIC application in May 2017, and we entered the operational phase in May 2018. And from news we received yesterday, the EMDRC will be one of the ESG landmarks included in this year's roadmap update. So the services provided by EMDRC are very similar to the ones I said before for our station. We provide access to biological resources, to ecosystems, to experimental facilities, technology platforms. We also have an active role in training and education. We work along with other infrastructures on providing access to new infrastructure, data, and services. And we have expert advice from a wide community of marine scientists and all the supporting facilities around them. So going into the matter at hand, in our station we have different kinds of access depending on the type of user, let's say. We have users, as I said before, even our own university researchers are users of the station, so we have no permanent research staff in the station, which is today more or less 50% of the total of requests of service we get in the year. We have users from other public research performing organizations and non-profits. This is the typical EMDRC user may come this way. They're normally researchers from other research performing organizations. And we have users from profit-making entities, from private companies. This could account for 30% of the total. And a special type of use is users coming from TNA programs, transnational access programs. Most of those belong also to the second category, but I separated them here because the costing system we use for them is different than the one we use for the rest. For the first 3, we use what we call a full costing model, and for TNA programs, we use a direct costing model, which will be what we will see right after. So in order to explain how we do this, I'm going to use 2 examples. The first one is a typical request we get. We get many times this kind of request from, for instance, fish feed manufacturers, and they want to carry out a fish nutrition experiment. So they tell us what requirements does the experiment have. In this case, for instance, this is a hypothetical example, an experiment with a duration of 2 months. They tell us we need so many experimental groups, we need so many fish in each tank, we need this number of replicates, this kind of tank. We want to provide this amount of seawater, filter this way with this temperature. We want to have experimental parameter control every 5 minutes. We want automated feeding, weekly samplings, whatever they need from us to carry out. Okay? And in order to provide this service, we calculate the costs that we are going to incur to provide it. So we normally divide our costs in 3 items, what we call direct costs, indirect costs that are directly allocated to the project, and then general indirect costs, which is, for instance, university administration, which are charged to the project on a fixed rate. We will go through this one by one so you can understand what we mean by each of these items. Starting by the direct costs, direct staff would be the first one. So we may have to hire someone specifically to carry out this project. So this would be account. We may charge only half of of a person's salary. But normally this is stuff that only works in this project, or that we can account how much time they devote to this project. The next cost item will be materials. So these will be materials purchased exclusively to provide this service. Energy. We cannot measure how much energy we spend in an experiment, but our highest energy cost is to heat or cool the water. So if we know how much water an experiment is going to use, and if we know what temperature they want to be in, and the temperature of the seawater at the moment, we can calculate and make a quite good estimation of the cost that we are going to incur in energy. So this is allocated directly to the service place. And then the last direct cost would be other, which is normally subcontracting. In this example, subcontracting would be if the user needs us to do some analytics of the fish fillet, for instance, at the end of the experiment, that we cannot do ourselves and we need to subcontract. Going into the indirect costs, those are costs that will be incurred whether the experiment takes place or not, but that we can allocate part of those costs directly to the project. So in this case, the depreciation of the equipment. If we have an equipment, for instance, the equipment to measure the environmental variables continuously. This equipment has a cost of 30,000 euros, for instance, and a depreciation period of 5 years. We know that the project is going to last for 2 months, so we can allocate 2 months of that depreciation to this project. And this can be done with the rest of the equipment that the project uses. Okay. Then in staff, when we put staff in indirect costs directly allocated to the project, this is staff that works for the marine station, that will work there whether the project occurs or not, and that dedicates time to work on this project. So we use time sheets to account for the time these people dedicate to this project, and we can allocate this cost to this specific project. And then the last indirect cost would be the use of the facilities, of the building, let's say, of the laboratory. I have put here depreciation into brackets because we are working on finding a way to allocate part of the depreciation of the building to these specific laboratories. We are working on the number of square meters, on a model based on the number of square meters, but there are a few variables that we still have not clear. So at the moment, this estimation you see here is more of an approximation than the real thing calculated objective. And then the last item we take into account is, as I said before, the general indirect costs, which would be, for instance, university administration, that are charged on a 10% markup over the rest of the costs. So with this, we have a costing system for full cost projects or services. One thing that is important to take into account and that we can discuss afterwards during the discussion is that a lot of the equipment in this research infrastructure is bought through public funds, through public projects, structural funds, regional funds, etc. So there's a question mark over charging part of this cost of this infrastructure to the service projects, because one could be incurring in double funding in a way. So this is something that needs to be really discussed with the finance people and to make sure that we are not running into this. And same happens with staff that is funded through public grants that may be working on the project or even materials. So this is something that needs to have a careful approach. We can discuss this afterwards, after the end of the presentation. The second example is what we call the direct cost model. For instance, the example we're going to use is the provision of biological resources. And what I'm going to explain here is the model we use for transnational access. There are costing rules for transnational access from Horizon 2020. So in order to do this, we need to account for the costs in the last 2 economic years, and we need to account for the quantity of access in that same period. So you have a total cost and the number of access, and you can calculate a unit cost of access. Okay? In this case, all contributions to capital investment are not eligible, and the direct costs, other than personnel for providing access, can only include cost of contracts for maintenance, consumables specifically used for this facility, costs of contracts for installation management. This is security fees, or even a quality system that certification that's in place, energy, power, and water supply for the facility, general costs, for instance, cost of shipping samples from one place to another, software licenses, internet connections, and specific scientific services that are included in the access. Okay. Apart from that, staff costs can also be taken into account, and all of these costs need to be paid by the institution. You cannot account for any costs that are paid through other grants, in order not to run into double funding practices. So this is an example of the biological resources unit. So we calculate for 2 years, from the 1st of January 2014 to the 31st of December 2015, and you have all the non-staff costs in this table. Okay, accounting for 139,577 euros. You add to that the cost of staff, which in this case is 160,000 euros, and on top of that, the H2020 rules, as for most of H2020 projects, account for 25% of overheads. So the total costs are the non-staff, the staff costs, plus the overheads, and in this case they account for a bit more than 375,000 euros. And our station has a system in place to keep track of all access. So our marine biological resources unit, in the period, in this 2-year period, provided 2,593 services. Okay, so this gives a unit cost for the service of 144 euros. So these are the unit costs that can be charged to this TNA code. Okay, and then you have to say how much access you want to provide in this specific project. And there is a non-written rule that this should be around 20% of your total capacity, of the total capacity of your research infrastructure. So what we say here is that we will provide 525 access units to this project. Okay, we've gone through all this. So what we are trying to do now is to use this ourselves, not only for TNA projects, We are trying to use unit costs as a solution for individual services in our station. For instance, for this biological resource unit, we have a problem that we provide many different services under this unit. So it can be the provision of 100 milliliters of microalgae concentrate, but it could also be the provision of 25 sea bass juveniles. So it's very difficult for us to put a price on that based on the costs we incur and on the number of services we provided during the year. But we are trying to do that through unit costs. But of course, in order to do that, we really need a lot of data, and it's not being easy. And another point for the discussion, this is already the last slide, would be which costing method to use to account for in-kind contributions in services from the nodes to the ERIC. So for instance, let's imagine that the contribution of a country to the ERIC is an amount of monetary contribution plus some services that the ERIC can make use of to provide services to anyone. Okay. One question would be, what would be the advantage of doing that? Why would we want to split the contribution into this kind of in-kind and the monetary one? And yeah, in this sense, I'm happy to hear your ideas or comments. So as I said, thanks very much to the Emery team for this opportunity, and I'm happy to discuss whatever comes up.
Thank you, Antonio, for your very interesting presentation. So now we can start a question and answer from the participants, from other colleagues. Please. Please, Christine.
Yes, maybe. Thank you very much, Antonio, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. And maybe I have just one question regarding the unit costs. You said that you are questioning using for individual services. What advantage do you, maybe I missed, sorry, the advantage you see of using this unit cost compared to the full cost model?
What we see is that for us, it's really, really difficult to allocate a cost to individual items we may produce. For instance, we produce microalgae. For us, it's very difficult to account for the time of the staff. The thing is that staff are doing many different things. They are working with the microalgae now, but afterwards they will go to work somewhere else. So we would need to keep really tight control of the time they spend doing each thing and the materials used. And for us, it's very difficult to allocate specific costs to the total production. So if we know we produce so many strains of microalgae during the year, and we know a big number of costs of that unit, we would like to try to have a unit cost for the microalgae. But the problem is, as I said before, is that many different activities are happening in these units, so we are having a hard time separating them. I don't know if I replied to your question.
Very, very good, Antonio. Thank you also, Christine, for raising these issues. This is an important topic also in terms of the design of cost accounting model. So, I mean, the measurement system of costing services. So this will be at least part of our next webinar if you want to go just to give some example of the design of different costing accounting system. And this measurement accounting system is called activity-based costing. In this perspective, the activity-based costing help the organizations to measure the right cost of individual activities. So it will be more reliable information on that. Of course, this measurement system is very highly costly. It's very difficult to be organized, and of course, the benefit to have it must balance the cost of getting the information. But of course, we will discuss how it works and what are the benefits of having this kind of measurement system with a very narrow object of measure, which are called activities within individual services. So now we have another question from Michela. Please, Michela.
Hello, thank you, Antonio, for your very interesting presentation. Have you ever tried to compute costs with the actual model cost? So you have indicated the costs as unit cost, but there is another way to calculate transnational access costs, which is the actual costs model. Have you ever tested it? Have you ever applied it?
Yeah, we ourselves in our station have not applied it. In most of the projects where we participate, in most of the TNA projects we participate. I know other EMDRC stations use the actual cost model. We use the unit costs because we have a good track of the services we provided in the past. Okay, so that's why we use the unit cost, because in the end for us it's simpler to manage, let's say. But for instance, other stations that don't have this track record of previous services, they need to go to the actual costs, which is very similar to the first model I explained. You account for the costs that you incur to provide that specific service that you will provide under the TNA program.
Antonio and Michela, is this a matter of means that in the first case you have to choose the right amount of the capacity to made available, and compared to the actual cost model, maybe that in this case you don't have a problem of capacity, so at the end you just calculate the real cost that you absorb in the activity? Is this the issue?
Oh, well, for example, Antonio, please.
Yeah, the issue has to do a bit with what you are saying. It relates, I wouldn't say to the capacity so much, it relates to your ability to track past services. You need to provide a proof of the number of services you provided in the last 2 years. If you can't do that, I would say from the MDRC experience that unit costs are easier to handle. Because when a user comes, you just say, this person came for 3 days, the rate is 300 euros per day, our unit cost is 300 euros per day, and that's it. What they audit is your 2 last years, okay? Yeah. If you are not able to provide those data, actual costs are better. And also, actual costs are better for projects that need something specific that may be really expensive. For instance, a lab reagent or something like that, that you need to do on actual costs. Because otherwise, your real cost to provide that service will be much higher than your unit cost.
Yes, I perfectly agree with you. In Excel, we have used actual costs to calculate costs for some facilities because the experiments we had to carry on in those facilities were very different from the standard, I may say, that the facility can provide. So the actual cost was the best solution for us to calculate costs.
Michela, but in any case, at the end, you just provide a certain amount of unit cost at the end, right?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the method you use. At the end, you have to provide the unit cost or the actual cost. The actual cost is just the list of what you have spent during the experiment. So the user reimburse you only for the costs that have occurred during the experiment. If you use the unit cost method instead, you have to estimate the cost before starting the experiment, and then the user pays you for the unit cost and number of access of days, for example, he accesses your facilities. So it's just a different way to calculate costs. Unit cost must be estimated before the actual cost. For the actual cost, you must provide a rough estimate before starting the project. But then, what it is written in the final statement is that what you have spent during the experiment. So it's just a list of items of budget, cost lines, and so, for example, consumables, personnel employed, and so it's the real cost of your experiment.
Okay, so we could say in terms of methodological issues, we could say that in the unit cost method, you just calculate a sort of standard cost for running the TNA access based on actual cost incurred in the last 2 or 3 years and so on. But this becomes a standard cost, which is expected to be what you pay for that access. And then, of course, you have to be accountable to stay within that cost. If you spend more, of course, it's your responsibility and not just recharged on the user. In the second method, in this case, you just have a sort of budget, and then you have a balance at the end according to the cost, real cost that you have incurred, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I have, yes, Marcus, please.
Sorry, before we go to the next question, sorry, yes.
Alicia, sorry.
I think that's a good point to make a summary, because people tend to mix things when it's about costing models. So what we have heard is that there are specific rules for transnational access in EU projects, and this is what Antonio has provided us with. And this was also, so there we have those two models, namely the unit costing or full costing, as Michela also mentioned, is also possible in EU projects. Independent of that, you have the real full cost model, when you start, and that's especially, I think, important for our attendees starting with new research infrastructures, is are you able, in terms of balancing which rule to go for, is to answer the question number one: will you be able to have an accounting system which allows you to measure the expenses for individual projects, and you know how deep can you go into real accounting here? And number two is the number of different services you want to provide, because the reasoning of the unit costing model of the European Commission in Horizon 2020 was to provide a tool. Originally a tool to those research infrastructures which only have one or maximum two different services, but no possibility to have full accounting of their expenses. So it is a simplified method, neglecting at the same time real indirect costs. Still, yes, there is a little bit of indirect costs involved, but that is only a part of the real overhead costs. Just to give you one example, typical universities, when you compare full accounting with overheads, typical universities would have an overhead rate of somewhere between 110 and 150% to really cover all of their expenses. And that part is, of course, completely neglected when you go for the unit costing. So the reason for the unit costing was, that's important to understand, to have a simplified method to calculate expenses in a research infrastructure where no deep full costing models are available, which on the other hand means if you start new and if you want to invest into developing a costing model for your services, it's always better to have the full cost model, because that is provides the full picture and the real picture of your expenses. But if you already run a research infrastructure, or that's the second choice, if you have a lot of, and that's again, thank you, Antonia, mentioning it, having a lot of very different services, very cheap ones and very expensive ones, then it's actually easier, not better, but easier to develop a unit cost model. I think that's important, especially for the new ones, to understand what are the differences and why would you go for the one and why would you go for the other. Thank you, Enrico.
Thank you, Marcus, for this methodological summary. Please, Alicia, thank you for your patience.
No problem. First of all, thank you, Antonio, for your presentation. Very interesting. I agree also very much with the Marcus comment. That's a bit linked to my question, but my main question is regards the unit cost. We know that it may be complicated or complex to do the calculation of the cost, but my question relates rather to the unit itself, which is probably sometimes even more complicated than the cost itself. How do you define your unit? What is really the unit of access in your case? Because in our case, I realized that during all these years it would be probably much more difficult to define specifically the unit than the cost. So if you could share your experience, how you define your unit, what's really the unit of access for you? Is it the project, never mind the services, or it's a one given service? And we can say that in one project you provide services, you can have different accesses, as many services you have, or it's still another way of defining the unit?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question. Okay, I'll tell you how we started and where we are at now. Our first experience was to try to have a unit cost for different services. Okay? So we have, for instance, we saw before. I'm going to try to have a slide here. The different services we provide. So we have, in order to provide we can measure in our station, we can measure how much access we provided to each of the different services. So we can measure how many users we had for access to ecosystems. That means how many people we took out to the sea to collect samples. Okay, we use our boat to take the scientists out to the sea and collect samples. We can track the number of users, and we can track the costs incurred to provide that service. So our first approach to this was, okay, we're going to have a unit cost model for access to ecosystems. We are going to have another unit cost model for a use of laboratories, because we can also track the number of users we had, and we can track the costs we incur to provide that. So in the end, we had like kind of 5 different unit costs, one per type of service. That was our first approach. But during time, the evolution has gone through access to our marine station, irrespective of the service. So we will charge, let's say we will make a profit with some services, and we will lose money with other services. So we charge per day, per use of the station, and that's it. So right now we only have one unit cost, which is access to Toralla Marine Station per day.
Okay.
Thank you. Please, Simone Campana, you're allowed to speak.
You can hear me?
Yes, very well, please.
I wanted to ask, how do you consider contingency? We do have a bit of an issue. It's the fact that it's a bit difficult to predict a priori how what the scaling of a service. So, and this varies depending on conditions that mature during the year. So we have to build some sort of contingency in our cost model, particularly for computing. I wanted to ask if you have something similar. So if you embed the contingency in the cost that you propose, or if you have different voices for contingency, or if you don't have this problem at all.
I lost you for a moment, so I think I understood your question. If we build into our model any kind of insurance against services we cannot provide, is that right?
Yeah, or services that eventually cost you more than you foresaw, or anything that needs some sort of contingency.
Yeah, I would say the unit cost model has that already embedded into it, because you have a historic of 2 years, and there will be services that were expensive, there will be services that were cheap, there will be services that cost more than you charge for it, and there will be services that you charge more than they cost. So I would think that the unit cost model kind of balances that.
It averages out, okay.
Yeah, with the actual cost model, as Michaela was saying before, you are covered on that, because you will charge the project with what it costs you to provide it. If I'm not sure whether you have to budget the service in advance, in which case you would be right. If you have to budget the service in advance and you will be reimbursed based on your budgeting, if your budgeting is wrong, you will lose money.
Antonio, but you do not have a sort of specific contingency item which is considered explicitly within the calculation, right?
No, but since you are using a historic of 2 years, in those 2 years, okay, there could be no fluctuation in this sense, but in 2 years, the normal thing is that you will balance. You will have an average price, let's say, an average cost, and that average cost is covering services that were profitable or services that made a loss.
Of course, this is strictly related to the rules of the European Union, but when you charge, for example, to profit-oriented companies, this is important, the issues of considering also a sort of contingency item in the amount of cost that you include in your indirect cost as well, at least, because the contingency issues which have been raised by Simone is very important, especially when you have a lot of autonomy in defining the amount of pricing that you are charging for the use. And so I agree that in that case, a sort of contingency fee should be included explicitly in your internal costing model.
Yeah. Now that you talk about pricing, during the presentation, I don't know why it jumped from slide 40 to slide 44, where I talked a bit about the pricing. Yeah, I can do that very fast now. Regarding pricing, you see slide 40?
Yes.
Is everyone seeing that? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. We have different prices depending on where the user comes from. We have users from our own university, as we saw before, users from other public research performing organizations, and users from profit-making entities. So our internal users, they are charged for 100% of the direct costs, for 20% of the indirect costs directly allocated to the project, and they are not charged any general indirect costs. Okay, so they don't pay for the university administration. The other public RPOs and non-profits, they are charged full cost, so 100% of the direct cost, 100% of the indirect cost, and the general indirect costs at a fixed rate of 10%. And in our case, what we do for profit-making entities is that we have a markup of 10% over the full cost. So you could say that for an individual service, the university would be making a profit for that service. In reality, the university is not making a profit because the rest of the services at the time that the equipment is not used already is much higher than this 10%. Okay? But if you look at it in a service-specific way, you could say that there's a 10% markup on the price of the service.
Okay. Any questions? Please, Vittoria, you're allowed to speak.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, Antonio, I have a question regarding the personnel cost. Because as you know, we have so many problems with the different institutions across Europe. How do you manage that at the level of this unit cost? Are you using some median or average, or how do you do that? Because, well, I suppose the unit cost is used for every service in other country, isn't it? Or it's different depending on the country?
No, it's a European, it's a rule by H 2020. So anyone participating in a transnational access program or call can use it. They will be using this one or the actual cost model explained before by Michael. Those are the two
unit. Excuse me, Antonio, but the unit cost is institution specific, to answer Victoria's question. So two different institutions, even for the same service, might have different unit prices. The methodology is the same, but of course the prices could be different from one institution to the other, even in the same EU project. And exactly because of such reasons, as you mentioned, Victoria, because staffing, for example, is different from one country to another.
Yeah, so what we charge in terms of staff, there are rules that you need to abide with. For instance, our institute has different types of staff. We have staff hired directly by the university, permanent staff. We have staff hired through a structural fund aid that is specific from our region to our institute. So we can hire technical staff through that. And then we have staff allocated to projects. Okay. The only ones we can put under the TNA scheme are the ones hired directly by our university. We cannot account for the cost of the people hired through structural funds, through projects, only the people hired directly through the university. And we do that according to the real cost. So we ask our finance department, what is the cost of this person? Because in the end, you will need to say who was involved in providing this service. These 3 people, okay, the cost of these 3 people is such and such. And those are the costs you can use to account to allocate to the project.
Thank you, Antonio. Other questions? No?
Maybe one question
yes.
from me. Antonio, from your experience, if you would do a comparison of full cost versus unit cost, taking the case you provide only one service, wouldn't you have the identical expenses? Wouldn't you have the same unit cost as in the full cost model, just minus all your indirect costs? If you calculate the unit model, assuming you have only one type of service, those numbers would be the same, of course, minus the indirect costs, right? Do you understand?
The only difference would be the time difference. I mean,
of course.
Yeah. So if things are a bit more expensive today, that would be the only difference.
Yes.
But you are right.
Now,
yes.
Yes. So when just, again, coming back to the original question, why would you want to go for the one or the other, or what are the pros and cons for the 2 models? The fewer services you have, the easier it would be to go for the full cost model, and the more services you provide, the easier, very likely, it is to go through a unit model. My second comment, because we were discussing contingency plan, as Simone was mentioning, one way where you have many different services, but only one average unit cost, is to develop individual unit costs for the different services, because that narrows down your potential error cases. Yeah? And of course, every year, looking back to the expenses of the last 2 years, you can accommodate for the future, for the next year, your unit costs. So developing a model where you can, wherever possible, of course, is to have to have individual unit costs per service instead of one unit cost for the whole institution.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that can happen in that sense is that by using, as we do now, only one service to describe the whole station, is that normally, at least in our case, services, they have a very different demand TNA-wise. Our internal users, our internal users may use more the biological resources services, but the TNA users, they always want to go for ecosystem access.
Yeah.
That's the most demanded service. If providing that is the most expensive service, don't go for a single service in the station, because you will ruin yourself.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and especially when you have services which are, as you just mentioned, more locally, and you have other services which are typically used for transnational access, that again influences your choice to go for the unit or for the full cost model.
Yeah.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Marcus, for your. Any other more questions? Just to complete our, we are almost done. to complete your very interesting presentation, Antonio, you raised a very important issues about when we use the full cost model for pricing services in research infrastructure, especially when we get equipment or buildings or staff paid through public funds and public projects, or maybe the same if we have a specific cost covered by membership fees, it's almost the same. So in that case, if we use the full cost model, as we have just seen in the previous webinar, this will be translated in, and this is included in the price, of course, of services. This will translate in income at the end of the year. So is it good to charge these costs if they are covered by in membership fees or capital grants through European unions? The answer is yes. First, because, for example, for the equipment, you have the amortization costs, which must be covered, of course, by these grants. But at the end of the grants, at the end of the life cycle of this equipment, the infrastructure should have the money to rebuild or to procure again this equipment. So in this case, you need to have cash flows available. In that perspective, you need to have these cash generating units through this costing of services, because these services are using this equipment. This is also applicable to the staff or other materials as well. But of course, the issues of the income does mean that this is a profit-oriented organization. It means that this income, this profit must be balanced with the overall cost at the overall organization level. And so at the end, it should be not too much higher, in order to have a sort of self-financing for the next future. So in this perspective, when you calculate the price for the service, you have not just to focus only at the individual service level, but you have also to look at the overall organization sustainability as well in the longer term. So in this perspective, you raised important issues. Yes, this is a sort of overcompensations, or in other terms, you are paying double and you are getting money 2 times. First time from the grants and the second time from the user. But again, the equipment must be rebuilt again and renewed after the life cycle. And of course, this profit in the shorter term may be used to increase and upgrade the services provided to the research community, as well as to have a sort of self-financing cash flow, which are used for continuing the operations, even if, for example, membership fees falls down, or maybe there is a collapse in the, especially for project grants and yes, maybe some periods where these project grants maybe not sufficient to cover the overall cost.
Enrico, maybe we have the term decommissioning.
Yes.
I think you meant it, but I think it's important to get that word into your heads, because very often for bigger equipment, the decommissioning of such equipment is at least as expensive as the Antonio, now we have your video, very nice. Is at least as expensive as the original buying costs or the cost to build up such equipment. And this is one of the reasons, and very often this is neglected, and that's one of the reasons why this so-called overpayment is absolutely okay to cover those expenses which you will have in a later stage in a research infrastructure. I mean, just imagine, Antonia, you have to stop your station from 1 year to the other, how much it would cost to get rid of all the building, all the equipment, etc., etc. These are, really sincere costs, which we typically do not take into account when we discuss pricing of services.
Yeah, definitely.
Enrico, shall we, because Antonio is showing us the in-kind provision of services from the nodes to the ERIC. Shall we stay for a minute with that?
Yes.
I still see Simone and Victoria's hands. Do they have another question, or is it from the previous one?
Sorry.
Okay, so I think that was still from the old one. Thank you very much, Antonio, for asking the question. Why would we want to show in-kind provision from nodes to the ERIC? And there are actually several reasons which you could imagine on. Number one is for transparency reason. Very often when we talk about the magnitude of a research we are comparing, or once you compare one RI with another, you easily come to the situation where you can, very nicely describe the volume, the expenses, the volume of investment into a single site one, like ESS in Lund, for example, or CERN, even higher. And it's not so easy to do the same in distributed research infrastructure. And very often then it is shown only the expenses of the central secretariat. And people would say, oh, wow, if that's all, I mean, that can't be really important. But in the case we can calculate and provide in-kind from national nodes to the headquarters, we can also calculate that magnitude, both the investment as well as running costs. So the reason why to do that, or why at least to consider doing it for new ones, is for transparency reason. The second reason, which I have come forward where that makes sense, is where the central secretariat or headquarters might have, where the headquarters would bring in different clients to the nodes, and then having a restricted number either of units or service time or whatever dedicated to provide to other clients, that is a second reason, because very often national or local nodes provide services to the local community. You have shown, I think, very impressively that 50% of your users are already.
Marcus, we have missed you. Probably there is a problem with the connection. Marcus? No, we missed Marcus. Yes, this is a very important issue for this, especially for distributed research infrastructure. And in-kind contributions, of course, requires not different costing models, depending on the kind of service provided, of course. But the important issues here is not just in terms of transparency, as Marcus mentioned before, but in my opinion, this is also part of the way in which you are accountable to your community and your funders as well, because through these monetary measures, you are able to calculate and demonstrate the value added that you are providing as a whole organization, not just the hub or the individual nodes or individual research centers within the national nodes and so on. So in this perspective, apart from what we have just discussed before in terms of how to measure and report in-kind contribution within the balance sheets, it's an important issue also for external reporting and discharge accountability. And of course, this will be discuss it later for within our further discussion. Now time is expired, so it's time to. Yes, please.
Yeah,
Antonio.
I just wanted to make a small comment on this. I think there's an important reason that we could say, an important third reason. I think it would be interesting to use this model in order to kind of as an insurance of the central office not becoming too far apart from the nodes. I don't know if I make myself clear. If you use this model, you make sure that the headquarters dedicate part of their time on making sure that users come to the different stations. And this link, maybe at the beginning of the functioning of the research infrastructures, is not really important, but with time, I see a risk of the headquarters separating a bit from the nodes.
This is a very important topic, and I think it's valuable to have a sort of position paper on that, which may come from some of you or within a field project or maybe a individual project as well. So if you want to start thinking, put some words on that, we can start framing some proposal to extend also the model to just to start. So, thinking about that because it's very new for distributed research infrastructure as well. So thank you very much, Antonio, for your very interesting presentations. I think this is also thinking of our attendees today. We have had some technical issues, but we're almost now done. So we are just seeing you at the end. So thank you very much, Antonio, and we will discuss further these issues in the next webinar that will be scheduled later. Okay. Bye-bye to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Antonio.